Hello all, and thank you very much for joining us today. It has been quite a year. The internet has been our lifeline. We've seen children working, taking lessons from home, parents working from home for the first time, and we've seen new infrastructure being rolled out through some of the projects that we do on community networks, internet exchange points, measuring the health of the internet, and debates about encryption and how to preserve the core integral architecture that we all have come to know and love. And we have with us today a fabulous panel of humans from around the planet. We have Nnenna joining us from Côte d'Ivoire. We have Azeem coming in from North London. We have Vint, one of the architects of our beloved internet, here with us today, and one of our founders. And Andrew Sullivan, our CEO, who has been a core part of internet architecture and also the Internet Engineering Task Force. So their bios are online. So I think what I'll do in order to preserve the time for Q&A and for you to hear from them is that I'll not go into too much of what they do. Just know that we have futurists with us, we have architects of the internet with us, and we have core voices around the world like Nnenna who are speaking to colleagues around the planet about the importance of the internet and keeping it open, free, globally secure. So I'm going to come up with some questions for our speakers and some that we've asked you. And we're going to do a bit of a speed round for everybody. So the first one I'm going to ask is, I'm going to start with Andrew. Andrew, how would you describe 2020 on the internet in one word? How would you describe it?
Constant.
Okay, constant. Any elaboration?
No, you said one word.
Excellent. Vint, one word to describe the internet in 2020.
Challenging.
Nnenna.
Lifeline.
Azeem.
Collaborative.
Excellent. Okay. From challenging and collaborative to the lifeline, let's go a little bit more into 2020. And COVID has accelerated both conversations and actions around the internet connectivity, access, as well as security. I'm going to start with Nnenna this time. Nnenna, what was the most interesting trend of the year for you?
Why are you beginning with me? You know I'm a troublemaker.
That's why I started with you.
Yes. So I hope I'm not going to deceive all of you, disappoint anyone. But the greatest kick for me was that all of the work I've done for the past 20 years have finally come to core. You know, we've spent our lives talking about the need to connect people. They need to keep internet available all the time. You know, in those days, I used to sing all of the internet, all of the people, all of the time, and keeping it on all the time and having broadband internet. I mean, we've talked about all of them. So the thing that stood up for me was that those who were my enemies became my friends, and I made them eat their words. You know, like I had the pleasure of like giving it back to them. You know, these governments, we used to come and say, you need your people connected, you need the internet for education, you need the internet for information, you need the internet for data, you need the internet in just in case there's a health crisis, you will need the internet. And they're like, no, the internet is social media, it is for young people. They were calling me, oh, Nnenna, which platform are we using? I'm like, I'm gonna call you back. I'm having something important. And the minister is like, Nnenna, please. Can I? I'm like, it's midnight. I need to go to sleep. They're like begging, can I call you 6 a.m.? I'm like, no, I'll call you back when I have time. You know, I know that's wicked, but I got some kick from this. But the real truth is the rubber hits the road this time around. And when the pandemic broke, the internet was there. And when I say a lifeline, I truly meant it. Everyone knew that were it not for internet connectivity, there will be more people dead than we have now. I mean, I'm sure that many more would have died in Africa with internet connection. So that is the first thing that came back to me. All of the work we've done as advocates, all of the policy advocacy we've done to governments across the world, all of the time that we have pushed them to adopt connectivity, broadband connectivity as a policy. All of the time we've said this is not just social, it is economics, it is digital empowerment, it is skills, it is life, it is information. All of that came in the person called COVID, and it hit them. And so personally, I found COVID and 2020 rewarding in my work, because finally I've been proved right, and finally I've got a chance to settle scores. Thank you.
Nnenna, brilliant. For many of us who've been in this space for so long, it really has been a very strange way to focus on the importance of the internet, its architecture, the access to it, developing more of it, securing it. Azeem, I'm going to go to you next. What do you think? What was the most interesting trend of the year for you with respect to COVID?
Well, I mean, Nnenna has been so pithy with her argument. I feel a pale shadow of the strength of conviction that she gave us. The word I used was collaboration, and the thing that struck me about this, the pandemic, and I started to track this in the third week of January, was that it really reminded me of the internet that I knew when I first went online, which was in 1991. And one of the first services I ever used was run by a chap called Paul Ginsberg, xxx.lanl.gov, the archive first preprint server. And I was online in London, following all of this great material put into the public domain. Johns Hopkins tracker for cases, which I started tracking when France had 4 cases. The fact that the genomics sequence of what was then called 2019 nCoV, wasn't called SARS-CoV-2, was shared across the internet by Chinese researchers. The fact that there was an ongoing collaboration across the internet on an ongoing basis. The first paper was about what was then called the Wuhan coronavirus, was published on January the 22nd. As of last week, there were 85,000 scientific papers available on preprint services and open access. So even if it was on a Reed Elsevier or Springer journal, a large number of these have been made open access. And that sense of collaboration took me back to what happened when I first fell down the hole of the internet in the summer of 1991. It was scientists collaborating globally, borders didn't matter, contribution mattered. And I think it really reminded me that after these sort of years of having to deal with sort of tawdriness and social media and mobs being coordinated on WhatsApp, that the essence of the internet, which is that it can bring us together for our very best, really was brought to life in the last 9 or 10 months.
That is lovely, bringing us back to the internet that many of you knew in the very beginning, where it was a collaborative tool and the pure essence of it. Andrew, I'm going to you next, and Vint after you. What was the most interesting trend of the year for you after we've heard from Azeem and Nnenna?
I want to pick up on something that Nnenna said, because there was this remark she made about being vindicated, about making people eat their words. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting very early on was this sort of near panic among a bunch of regulators that, we're going to have to make the internet smaller because maybe there's going to be too much traffic and everything. And I mean, I know that a bunch of people had late nights at IXs and so on, but the truth of the matter is none of the infrastructure broke at all. It worked just fine. And I think what that is really a testament to the design itself, to the basic architecture of the internet, that it is adaptable and that it adapts, that the mechanism of each network doing its thing and all collaborating using a common protocol so that they interconnect according to their needs and according to what they can contribute is a basic architectural strength that is designed right in. And we're very fortunate that Vint and people like him thought about this in advance, thought about how this could scale, thought about how things would work together, and didn't design a centrally controlled thing that the regulator needs to step in and tell everybody, hey, turn your dial down because it's all going to break if you don't do that. No, it's not going to break. And the reason it's not going to break is because the network operator knows what to do for their network. And I think that's the sort of core genius of the internet. And talk about a good proof case for it. We upended all of the patterns. I find it constantly amusing that people keep telling me, no, we have to connect all the schools in the world, or we have to connect all of the hospitals, or some class of thing. No, you have to connect everything. Connect it all, because you don't know where the demand is going to come from, and the network will adapt. It doesn't need for you to plan it for it. The internet will plan itself. It will work itself. That's how it's designed. That's the technology. That's the genius of this mechanism. And failing to recognize that and embrace it is exactly the kind of mindset that gets us into these ideas that we're going to do some sort of global plan for $2 trillion we're going to spend right now. No, you don't need to do it all in one go. You need to do one thing at a time, one network at a time, build it up, because that's how the internet grew in the first place. That's how we got the first half of the globe connected, and that's how we can get everybody else connected too.
Thank you, Andrew, Internet. Vint, over to you. What was the most interesting trend for you this year?
Well, first of all, everyone has pointed out that during 2020, it became increasingly apparent to a great many more people than before how vital the internet could be in the aftermath of the COVID-19. It's not an aftermath, but in the presence of the COVID-19 pandemic. But this shone an extremely bright light on the fractures in our social and economic fabric. It shone a bright light on the lack of access to the internet where it was needed. It showed that it was not necessarily economic for many people, even if it were available. In many cases where it is available, it wasn't available in adequate quantities. And although I appreciate Andrew's point about the internet not collapsing, it still showed that we need to build more of it where it can make a big difference. Second thing, which is weighing very heavily in my mind and into 2021, is that while we have seen the utility of this network, there is vast inequity, not only in access, but in the utility of the network. There are people for whom working from home doesn't work, or working on the internet doesn't work. There's jobs that require proximity, that require physical interaction. The internet doesn't necessarily help that. So we should be cautious not to overvalue the internet while recognizing that there are other things that need to be dealt with as well. So during the 2021 period, all of those issues need to be addressed and can be, as Andrew says, not everywhere all at once. In fact, the genius of the internet to some extent is that it was largely underspecified. We did not build too many barriers to expansion and variation, to implementation, to business models, which were permitted to vary anywhere from government operated to nonprofit to for-profit. So I think the big challenge right now is making sure that as we grow the internet and make it more accessible, we cope with all the other hard problems that are arising: access control, the potential of censorship, the network shutdowns, the security, safety, strong authentication, identity theft. All of the harms that show up have to be dealt with. And that weighs very heavily in my mind in terms of tackling those problems during 2021 and in the out years to make the internet really useful for everyone.
Thank you for that, Vint. And for those that are just joining us, we have a great panel here for you. Azeem, Nnenna, Vint, and Andrew answering some questions that we put forward to them. The most recent question that they just answered was, what was the most interesting trend of the year for you? And before, one word to describe the internet. We're going to switch over to our last set of questions. And I'm going to start with Azeem and shift over to Andrew, Vint, and then Nnenna. So I'm changing it up a little bit. Nnenna, you were, as you said, you're a bit of a troublemaker. I don't believe that. You're one of the greatest catalysts we have. I want you to hear the other answers to these questions, and then we'll end with you on this round. So what challenges, the question, do you see up ahead for 2021? Do you foresee any trends in the industry and the internet next year? Look at your crystal balls. Let us know what you think. Azeem, over to you.
Of course, thank you. Well, 2021 is only 1 year, so it's a bit short to do any kind of trend analysis. So let me just throw this out a little bit, a slightly longer time frame. I think the toughest question that I wrestle with is what happens around the question of standards and multi-stakeholder governance of the global network. And I see a big battle or set of angry conversations happening between China, the US, and the EU, and their relationships both with each other, but also with their big technology companies. So, we often think of, the EU trying to clamp down on American big tech companies, but of course, China has taken issue with privacy violations from their own big tech firms there as well. And I think how this battle royale emerges, where there are no clear sides, there are disagreements really between each party, is quite an interesting one. And I think that the biggest challenge here is that nations are going to want to assert themselves, and that one of the issues with multi-stakeholder governance is that people have to give way. And if you're the party that has had the dominant paradigm in describing what a network or a set of norms ought to be, any introduction of new parties to that convention lessens your relative power. And I think that has been part of the challenge of what's happened with internet and digital governance, and in respect with the US government and its own particular perspectives on what things ought to look like. There's a second thing that I would like to see happen much more of, which is the reassertion of global digital commons, and starting to see what parts of the network we can look at as global public goods. And in a sense, that was one of the great gifts of the internet that Vint designed, which was this amazing gift. It was an amazing public good that has, over the last 15 to 20 years, been increasingly privatized. And I think we've lost something there. So the pessimistic side of me says it's a terrible argument about splintering governance, national security, territorial sovereignty on the one hand, and on the other hand, an opportunity for us to argue for the recreation of certain types of global public goods, a global commons if we can.
Thank you, Azeem. So looking in your crystal ball, looking at a commons approach. Andrew, what challenges do you see up ahead for 2021? Do you foresee any trends in the industry and the internet next year?
Well, I want to pick up on something that Azeem just said, because it strikes me that one of the things we're seeing is not just governments asserting their, historic rights and claims of sovereignty, but an extension of that into claims about how the network really ought to work. So one of the things that I've been reflecting on recently has to do with, when the internet was being commercialized in the first go round, a lot of governments seemed to approach it with a recognition that they didn't really understand how this technology worked, and that they needed to learn about that before they made too many regulations and so on. And because most of the people who are policymakers have now lived in this world for a long time, they no longer recognize it as an unusual design. But it is, in fact, it remains a remarkably unusual technical approach. That the design of a very large infrastructure that literally has, by design, no center, and so no center of control, is a radical idea, and one that I think many people in seats of government have not really internalized. And so they keep talking about it as though it's this smooth hole that they can pick up and move over, 8 inches to the left, and that would be the way to regulate the internet. And we keep running into this whenever you get a sort of idea, oh, we'll regulate the internet here. Well, you can regulate the internet where you are. Of course you can. You're national government, you're sovereign where you are. The problem you have is that it doesn't behave that way when it leaves your borders, and you don't have the ability to do those things. And this is a tension that I think is only going to get worse, because there are a lot of social interests in addressing a number of issues that are instantiated on the internet, even if they're not really internet issues. And so I think that is one of the things that we're going to have to confront over the next several years. I thought this response on the part of certain regulators to sort of try to define what the internet would do under conditions of pandemic was a good hint of that, sort of churn that has happened recently. So I think that's something that is really going to have to be addressed in the next several years.
Thank you, Andrew. And for some on the call, it scared the pants off us when we started to talk to some regulators in Latin America who said, oh gosh, the pandemic means, to Andrew's point, we need to centralize things. We need to go away from this decentralized approach. And our team spent a lot of time talking to people and just saying things are working out. Don't mess around with this right now. Vint, over to you. What challenges do you see up ahead in 2021? Do you foresee any trends?
The two challenges that I see are related to some of the comments that have been made. One of them is fighting fragmentation. The other one is fighting abuse. And I mean these in the largest possible sense. It's already been suggested that the Treaty of Westphalia way back in 1648 created the notion of national sovereignty. And now we're hearing people talking about digital sovereignty. And we're seeing what happens as a result of that, an attempt to draw a boundary around the internet to control it inside of the country. But that has led to what I'll call extraterritorial reach. If you look at the GDPR, for example, in Europe, others are beginning to emulate that, but it has side effects, one of which is to say, well, we don't want information to leave this country. We want it to stay here physically because we can protect it better. Well, what that does is wreck the utility of a distributed cloud-based system with lots of data centers in various countries, so you can replicate data in order to assure that nothing gets lost, to offer service even if a data center goes down. So cloud-based providers will collide with some of the national policies that are being adopted. And it's an interesting thing. You say, look at all the abuses, we have to do something about the internet. And the real answer is no, you have to do something about the abuses of the internet. And I think that's the important point that needs to be stressed. Now, in order to do that, it's going to require cooperation and collaboration, a point that's been made earlier, because tracking down people who are doing harmful things on the net may mean dealing with trans-jurisdictional or trans-border cooperation. The victim may be in one country and the perpetrator in another. So 2021 is going to have to focus on the ability to collaborate in order to deal with abusive behaviors. And hopefully the legislators will recognize the value of interoperability, connectivity, and free transborder data flow. If they don't recognize that, the utility of the internet could very well diminish.
Thank you, Vint. Nnenna, over to you. Challenges up ahead, trends.
I'd like to follow up from where Vint stopped. And I want to talk about 3 Ds. The first is the divide. The second is the distrust. And the third is discrimination. Divide, as I see it, for the moment, we have half the world connected. We've had COVID. I think there's going to be a rush to create services, apps, and all of those for people who are already connected. And we will keep talking about the need to connect other people, but we might not invest in connecting the unconnected. So what is going to happen is that we are going to continue working from home. We are going to continue schooling from home, and then we are going to widen the divide that already exists between the rural, the unskilled, the unconnected, and the skilled. the urban and the broadband connected. So I think we need to watch out about the divide. The second is the distrust. 2020 has shown us all the distrust between users and platforms or companies, has shown us the distrust between companies and governments, and has shown us the distrust between government and citizens. I mean, look at what we've seen in Twitter. A president of a country that is said to be the most important in the world is tweeting, and then Twitter is putting unverified. I mean, it's flagging half the tweets of a president, and people are like, you know, we don't know who to trust. And the fake news has grown big everywhere, and as Vint said, abuses have come online. Web Foundation does a lot of research in all of this, so the trust level is gone very low. I've tried my own, I mean, everyone's tracking the data. I have seen, and I can say that the countries where COVID response has been best are the countries where there is a higher level of trust between citizens and their governments. The last is discrimination. There's a lot of online discrimination. There is a lot of internet-empowered discrimination, but that's the smaller part. As humans, we've seen the Black Lives Matter. We've seen End SARS in Nigeria. We have seen a lot of social movements showing up, partly because maybe we've been locked down and people can't just take shit anymore, but also because there is great discrimination, and the health pandemic has brought to fore many other human pandemics. And so that discrimination, and people have seen that we can push and get things, I mean, get our voices heard. I think those are going to come to fore. So those three, divide, discrimination, and distrust, I think are going to be greater challenges as we move ahead.
Thank you very much, Nnenna. I like your 3Ds. And I was thinking of Mind the Gap when you were saying from the connectivity side. It's cyclical, whether we're building or building up, looking at what doesn't exist, collaborating, as Azeem has said so eloquently, with respect to researchers, Vint about the inequities that we're seeing, Andrew on the architecture, and how do we keep those out there from trying to fragment that architecture or trying to technically keep it bound or politically keep it bound. Thank you very much for that first round. We're going to go to some Q&A now. And this is where I'm going to ask for some help. We have asked our audience for their thoughts on questions for you. And so I'm going to put it out to all of you now. And let me just ask Lois, how much time do we have, Lois, for Q&A now? 15 minutes?
We have around 25 minutes, actually. We're running ahead of schedule.
Oh, bravo. Okay, Azeem, I'm going to start with you on this one. It's a connectivity question that has been submitted in advance by some of our audience members. This is a bit of a funky one, having to do with low Earth orbiting satellites. So what kind of impact do you think Starlink will bring to the internet and its stakeholders?
Turn off. Great, thank you. There's definitely a gremlin here. Every time I press the mute button to turn myself off, someone else comes in and remutes me. So we'll work that out. Well, Starlink just to get everyone on, I guess, the same page, is this sort of constellation of low Earth orbit satellites providing internet access that's launched by one of Elon Musk's businesses. And from the reviews that I have seen of people using Starlink, it's pretty impressive in the sense that it's surprisingly low latency, it's pretty high bandwidth, and it gets places where fiber doesn't easily reach. So I think that's all quite high potential, but there are a couple of considerations that that I would make on this. The first is that, I think we've learnt about what happens with network monopolies over a couple of 100 years, and certainly what happens when network monopolies emerge in a completely unregulated ways in any market. So I would be concerned about of course, there are short-term benefits, but what happens in the long term, in the medium term, in terms of internet access and free internet access, by which I mean sort of unfiltered, unmoderated, uncontrolled, as opposed to sort of free as a cost, over the longer period of time with Starlink. I think there's a second question around Starlink, which raises a really important one about whether or not technology is neutral, is ethically neutral in some sense or not, which is that Starlink, of course, has now created a lot of light pollution in space, and something that's problematic for astronomers whose telescopes are closer to Earth than they are to space. In other words, unless you're using the Hubble or something similar, your view starts to get occluded by Starlink. And I think there was an important question around where does the debate around the externality of Starlink, which is this unpriced cost of light pollution for space researchers, where does that get discussed, and how do we make that decision? And I think it's important for us to have these conversations, because when the internet was small, it was full of potential and really full of lots of upsides. Now that it is this large global thing and these large corporations can scale very, very rapidly, we need to start to ask questions about what are the impacts of the design choices that they take that are outside their own business. So very exciting that we could start to deliver internet to many parts of the world where it's hard to get fiber at such rates. But of course, we always have to keep an eye on companies that achieve monopoly power, and we have to keep an eye on the questions of who really bears the cost of their access to this global commons, which is space.
Thank you very much. And again, this good point that you're making about the global commons and some considerations we have to think about. Vint, I'm going to ask you a question that came in about consolidation in big tech. The question is, will, when, and how will big techs be forced to open up their data vaults?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it depends on what data people expect to have access to. I would point out that there's a lot of data that we hold at Google, just to pick a concrete example, people's email, their documents, all the other things that they use our product and services for, which should not be accessible to anybody except those that have been authorized by the holder of that data. So I think the demand for access to data needs to be, at the very least, filtered. There's also some question about business models and the interference with reasonable business models, and we could argue about what's reasonable. The other thing I would point out is that for a lot of these companies, there's an economy of scale, which is at work here. And we hear about people trying to break things up, and the argument I would make is that be careful about that, because the economy of scale that made things affordable may be toppled by that. So I'm very concerned about thoughtless demand for access to data. And so if such demands get made, or if policies are established, I hope that they take into account Azeem's point about externalities and consequences of making demands like that.
Thank you, Vint. Nnenna, I'm going to come to you. There was a question. It's a broad question, but you've given us some of the 3Ds. So I'd like you to give some thought to this. The question is the internet equitable? It's quite a question. And by internet, I think that it gives us, is it a monolith? We're talking about the separate networks, but is the internet equitable? What do you think?
Anyone knows anything that is equitable in this world? I mean, even the fingers of our hands. We agreed, we the people, we agreed that we are all born equal in rights and in dignity. And then later on in practice, we see that some are more equal than others. I mean, with Vint here, we should lay down the option We should lay down the answer that the internet is created to be equitable. I mean, that's why we are here for net neutrality. That's why we're here, that users are treated the same, traffic is treated the same. But in practice, we know that it does not really happen. It's not the infrastructure itself. It's not the internet infrastructure that makes it inequitable. It is us human beings who have made it inequitable. Now, I so much loved Azeem and Starlink and all of those. And I wanted, like, what the hell are you talking about? It's like giving $1 million to everyone. It's not going to drive away poverty, because there are other things that support the running of the internet as a global good, as a global common. The respect of human rights itself. I mean, it is easy to say you have respect for freedom of expression, but then after you express yourself, what happens? So the pillar of respect of human rights is one where we already see that there is a divide. There is even the basic infrastructure of the place. I mean, how can you work from home when you don't have electricity? That's a basic question. How can a mother who can neither read nor write help the child school from home? These are things we take for granted. How can you work from home when 1 gigabyte of data is more than 10% of your monthly income, and you don't even know whether your employer is going to pay for the connectivity or not? So it is not the architecture of the internet. It's not the infrastructural, I mean, it's not the design of the internet that is the problem. It is the everyday use of it. It is the policy, it's the global infrastructure, it's the skills, and it's the husbands who said the internet belongs to them and they will give it to their wives and children when they feel. I mean, we live in a man's world, ultimately. Whether you are in Silicon Valley programming or you are in Africa, it is the world that has gone to the internet, and it is not an equitable world. And I doubt that we will have an equitable use. And I doubt. My answer is, in one single sentence, I highly doubt that we will have an equitable access, benefit, and use of the internet.
Thank you for that, Nnenna. Very powerful, and something for us to think very hard about. I'm going to ask one more question, and this came from, again, our audience. This is for Andrew. Andrew, how do we deal with the different perspectives of global internet between the Eastern and the Western? This touches on some tricky topics, but what do you think about that question?
Well, I'm not too convinced that this is really an East-West divide. I think that this is a divide between people who like the internet way of networking and people who prefer another model of networking. The internet is not the only way to build a network. We've in fact had previous networks that, surrounded the globe. We've had non-electronic networks like the postal network, for instance, which developed a whole set of procedures and everything like that so that you could get letters to go internationally long before we even figured out how to send messages electronically, through the telegraph or anything like that. So we know how to build different kinds of networks. But the critical thing about the internet is this architectural feature that I was talking about before, that the power of the connectivity really comes from the network that wants it. That is, I have a problem, I want to solve that problem, so I connect to others. And I just use the protocols that have been designed. I don't have to get permission. I don't have to go and petition somebody. I mean, obviously, I have to develop enough of a relationship with somebody else in order to connect to them. But how that happens or what the motives are for it or something like that, those are not centrally controlled. That's not a central function. Now, there are people, and some of them are in the East, some of them are in the West, some of them are in the North, some of them are in the South. They're all over the globe, who want, who don't like that model of networking. They prefer a model in which somebody is the boss. Somebody is in charge of what kind of connectivity happens, who may connect, what they may use that connection for, and so on. And that model is appealing to a lot of people. And it's appealing for obvious reasons, that in a time of tremendous uncertainty, it sometimes, you know, is comforting to say, oh, I know who the authority is here and I can appeal to them. For the authority, him or herself, of course, it's extraordinarily appealing to be able to say, no, I'm the boss here and you're going to do what I say. And I think that model is one that we are seeing people reach for, and they're attempting to graft that onto the internet. And so they start talking about, you know, this or that nation's internet, this or that economy's internet, and we hear those kinds of things, right? The national internet, national network infrastructure. There are countries where they didn't start with good internet infrastructure. And of course, they built their infrastructure, their networking infrastructure, maybe using internet protocols, but not really with the internet way in mind. There are other countries who bizarrely have decided to take their extraordinarily robust infrastructure and make it weaker on purpose in order that they could get more central control. And you hear about this, right? Countries that have gradually diminished the robustness of local interconnections in order to try to keep things nationalized, and they're lowering the interconnectivity between their country and other countries. I find this to be a terrible tragedy. Like it's like deciding that you don't like your house, so you rip off one of the walls without thinking about what you're going to do when the winter comes. You know, you really need to have a plan for all the walls to be there. And I guess maybe I'm more attuned to this right now because I'm in Canada. But the fundamental issue, from my point of view, is that they're doing harm to themselves and to their own countries, their own economies, their own people, because of this fear of the power that the network gives to individuals. I understand that fear. I understand what it is that people are concerned about. But I genuinely believe that the internet way is the best way. And it's the best way because it is more inventive and it is more likely to contribute to the welfare of all of the people who are connected to it than the alternatives. That isn't to say it's magic. That isn't to say it's going to solve all of the things. I think Nnenna is exactly correct that there's all kinds of issues related to how people use any tool that, you know, that's really important. But at the same time, this technology is the one that puts that kind of control back in the hands of individuals, of people who can solve their own problems. And we should keep that in mind because it is one of the things about the internet that is so marvelous. It is such a human technology precisely because it enables people to do their own thing. And that to me is the thing that we ought to promote. So when somebody says to me, you know, oh, well, what about this other style of, you know, the internet? That's not the internet from my point of view. That's a network, all right, but it ain't the internet. And we shouldn't confuse ourselves with, you know, with that sort of semantic trick.
Thank you. And Andrew, we're going to go with one more question for each of our panelists. We've decided to just point you simply to our action plan 2021. If you're interested in what we're doing in the future, I'm not going to describe that for you as it was in the agenda before, because we really are keen to get more dialogue here. So Vint, I'm going to turn to you about a question that came into us. It's a question about social media, and it's, will social media be regulated by Western democracies, or how? It's an interesting one. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's pretty clear there already is a clear intent to do something. And this is an aspect of the abuse problem that I alluded to earlier. The fact that people are given an amplifying megaphone when they get on the internet is both a benefit and a difficulty. So the decision to treat social media not as a simple bulletin board that anyone is free to put anything up on, is not surprising. And I think that we already see certain amounts of constraint and restriction, self-limiting of those social media. Child pornography, for example, is filtered as best that they can in almost all the media that I'm familiar with. The only exception to that might be the dark web, which is intentionally set up to be hidden for nefarious purposes. So yeah, I think the answer is that there will be either self-constraint or that we will be imposed some constraints. And I'm not surprised to hear this. I mean, I think people are looking for the balance between protecting people's interests and safety and privacy and security, while at the same time getting the enormous advantages that the other panelists have already articulated out of this basic infrastructure. So the answer is yes, something will happen. It may be a combination of real regulation and self-regulation.
Thank you for that, Vint. Azeem, a question came in, and this is a loaded one. Will the internet fragment? What do you think about that?
It's already fragmenting.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a paper that several of us wrote for an IGF in 2018 on internet fragmentation. It is already fragmenting, and the important thing is it fragments at multiple layers. In different places in the architecture, there are opportunities for fragmentation. And a good example of a major initiative is called MANRS, M-A-N-R-S, which is an attempt to get the RPKI infrastructure in place so the BGP won't be the avenue through which fragmentation is deliberately injected in the system. But we see fragmentation occurring at higher levels up in the application space as well. So the answer is it's inescapable. Countries are capable of imposing certain kinds of fragmentation. Business models sometimes do the same. So the answer is yep, and all we can do is try to minimize that fragmentation as much as possible to preserve the connectivity that Andrew pointed out is so important to the internet way.
Thank you, Vint. And Azeem, on that same topic with splintering, you brought up multi-stakeholderism. Can you give us a little bit more on what you meant by the difficulties with multi-stakeholderism when parties come in with less power or more power?
Yeah, well, I think this connects to also, first of all, thank you for Vint for answering the original question so much better than I would have done, which is wonderful. I want to connect back to what Andrew said and about the purpose of the internet, the value of the internet, those internet qualities, which is that it gives power to the end nodes. And I think we need to acknowledge, even if it's a bit uncomfortable to acknowledge that even if we all, 100 of us on this webinar, think that that is an essential value, perhaps even a prime human value, that is still, in a sense, a value judgment on our part. And when it gets expressed through infrastructure like the internet, it also becomes a political decision. I don't mean a partisan decision like, Republicans versus Democrats or Conservatives versus the Labour Party in the UK. I mean a discussion that is about power and the kinds of arrangements that allocate power and that allow there to be subsidiarity. And so much as I, like Andrew, love the idea of putting power to the nodes where the action actually happens, we have to recognize that that's not the state of nature. That is an argument that we have to make in the domain of the public opinion and in the domain of politics. And insofar as, and so this gets to the point about multi-stakeholders and who has the power. I mean, essentially, the model of the internet that has done so well comes from a model of the internet, of governance that is somewhat laissez-faire, in a sense, that there isn't in the core protocols a sense of content inspection, right, or packet inspection, and but there are rules around what you can do within your own autonomous system, right? I mean, the BGP issues that arose earlier, and I think that I can see the benefits of that and have long argued for it, but I also now recognize that those are design choices that might not have been the choices that other countries or political cultures would have come up with. And I think some of the suggestions that we saw coming out of Chinese network companies like Huawei in the last couple of years about sort of content safety and harmony being something that ought to sit within modern network protocols is an example of that. And that, I think, is the discomfort that we'll have around the sort of multi-stakeholder process, which is that if we want it to work, we'll have to let other people in, and they may have very different views.
Thank you, Azeem. I'm going to turn to Andrew with the questions in the chat, and then Nnenna after that on working with governments. Andrew, in 2 minutes, what can be done to mitigate the proposal by China to create a new IP network via ITU-T? That's in the chat. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure that we can do justice to that in 2 minutes, unless what you're asking is, like, can I do it in the next 2 minutes? Can I stop
yes,
a new
please.
IP?
Can you give us?
I think, but I think this actually connects very nicely with the point that Azeem just made. That you know, it's certainly true that when anybody creates a transformative technology, it embeds a number of things. Assumptions that were, you know, in the minds and hearts of the people who create that thing, and you know, different cultures will create a different sort of connectivity. The interesting thing about the new IP proposals that we've seen, however, is that figuring out precisely what they are is a little like nailing Jell-O. It isn't clear what problem it is they're supposed to solve, and it isn't clear that if you did that, you would still have something that ought to be called on the internet. Those are two very different problems, right? The first is an engineering question about, you know, what problem is it that you're trying to solve? And a lot of the time, the answer to that is highly political, because people are trying to avoid telling you the truth about precisely what it is they're trying to solve, or maybe they don't know precisely what it is they're trying to solve, or sometimes with engineers, it's true that this is the solution that I have. Now, what is your problem again? Because that's another thing that engineers like to do, right? They've got their technology. So those are all bound up in the first question, and I don't know what to do about all of that. And then there is this second question, which is, would we call it the internet, supposing that we had it? Would it be a new IP, or would it just be a different networking technology? And I think that is that's a different question that we need to ask. Should we have the internet at all? Is fundamentally what that question is about. And that really is a social question. It's a political question. But I would say this about it, and then I'll stop. And that is, the internet is now a fact. It's something we've invented. John Culkin, who was an interpreter of Marshall McLuhan, liked to say, we shape our tools and thereafter they shape us. And I think that this is a really important fact about the internet. It has created a new world that we're in. And we could try to go back and put that genie back in the bottle, but I think it's too late.
Nnenna, as Andrew's saying, the genie may be out of the bottle, but we've both been in conferences where we have to talk to governments about this thing called the internet and trying to help preserve it and or not to damage it or harm it. What do you do, Nnenna, when you're in a room with a regulator or policymaker and you're in front of them trying to convince them that we need to keep it open, globally connected, secure, more equitable?
I did love the last line, and the genie's out of the bottle and it's not going back, right? It's either you hop on the train or you walk home, whichever one. But hey, it's there. And so, I mean, 10 years ago, we were publishing and saying the social media is here to stay. And in fact, there was a time I recall in this country that I lived in, using Skype was going to give you a prison statement. Was going to hand you a prison term, because the mobile technology, the mobile telephonic companies, whatever, this was a crime. It couldn't happen. You couldn't do IP telephony and all of that. And we were saying this is something you cannot run away from. I have a story that I always tell, but that's a long one. It's about Netherlands and the water. The Netherlands have a lot of water around it. A lot of the land of the Netherlands is reclaimed from water. what they've done is to say, we have water, we can use water, let's study water and understand how to make the best use of it. And the Netherlands says everyone who goes to school must learn how to swim. And so it has become, water and Netherlands have become friends. And the Schiphol and all of those, one of the biggest ports in Europe is in the Netherlands, and they're making money out of it. Burkina Faso is in the Sahel region. They don't have any sea by them. And there are more people who die of drowning in Burkina Faso than there are in the Netherlands, because Burkina Faso has no policy about their citizens handling water, knowing how to swim. So there is no point in any government locking itself up. In French, they said, l'oiseau se cache pour mourir. When you hide yourself, you will eventually die. If you don't open up, you will eventually be wiped out. So the internet is here to say, it's not just humanity, we are digital humanity. I mean, homo numeris, homo digitalis, I don't know what it is we're going to call it, but it is here to stay. I have been speaking with regulators, I will keep speaking with regulators, and I've been doing so for the past 20 years. The internet is here to stay. It is not going away. You have a population, you have an economy, you have a territory, you have a future. Do you want to die or do you want to live? Finally, like we say, if you do not exist on the internet, it is like you do not exist anymore. So the question will be, do you want to be existent or do you want to be inexistent? The choice is yours. To be or not to be, to connect or not to connect. That is the question.
Bravo, Nnenna. Thank you. This is a perfect wrap up. To be or not to be, to connect or not to connect, minding the gap for inequities and inequality in connectivity. As Vint and others have said, collaboration from Azeem, Andrew on the core critical properties of the internet we know and love, and where we want to try and avoid fragmentation where we can. But how do we continue on and go forward with governments, with stakeholders, recognizing that our multi-stakeholderism does disempower some people as they come to the table, and how do we work together to continue this architecture that we so know and love, and look at both the human side and the technical side. So thank you all. We had Nnenna from Cote d'Ivoire, Azeem coming with us from London, Andrew in Canada, and Vint in the United States, and many of you from around the world tuning in. We've recorded this, and this Internet After 2020. There's much to think about, lots to collaborate on, and we just thank everyone for their participation today, and for the team here at the Internet Society who helped put this together. I'm going to turn this over to the capable hands of Lois. Lois, over to you to help close us, but thank you very much. This was, I love dialogues like this because it does spur debate, innovation, in my mind, of what we can work on together and where the path may be in the future.